Hello, my name is Aleksandre Asatiani, and I would like to welcome you back to our next lecture. Today we will be talking about making remote work sustainable. And by sustainable here, I mean the kind of work that we can carry out remotely for a long period of time without damaging our workers' health, well-being, and productivity. This lecture is based on the deep research that we have done on the literature about remote work from last 20 years. And there we found certain factors that affect the sustainability of the work. And here we would like to discuss what those factors are and how they explain negatives and positives of remote work on the remote work sustainability. Again, whether that's being productivity, health, or well-being. And we have 5 such factors that we have identified. The first factor is key characteristics of worker and the workplace that they're working at. Factor number 2 is work-life balance, or in the absence of balance, work-life conflict. Number 3 is health and well-being effects of remote work on the workers, a very important component in the sustainability of remote work. Number 4, social interaction and the role of social interaction in remote work sustainability. And finally, we will talk about the role of leadership and leaders. So let's start. So the first one is the factors and characteristics of workers and workplace in sustainability of the remote work. And here we have 3 dimensions of remote work readiness. First dimension is job, second one is personal, so personal to the worker performing the job, and third we have environmental factors, environmental readiness for remote work. So first, we need to of course ask ourselves, how easily can job be performed remotely? Different types of jobs are different in terms of how amenable they are to remote work. So for example, a job of an accountant is not that difficult to make remote. However, a job of a construction worker is slightly different business. It's very difficult to do construction work without being at the construction site. So for each individual job, we're going to need to look at how amenable it is to making it remote. And depending on that, we will need to make a certain adjustment to make remote work possible, if it is possible at all, and also sustainable, that workers can carry out those tasks successfully. Second dimension is personal. So here we need to talk about how prepared, skilled, and willing the workers are to work remotely. And here's all the different types of skills and capabilities that one might need. First, you might of course need some digital skills. So you need to be able to work with digital tools that are such a key in remote work. But also, it matters of how skilled you are in doing your job. In our research, we found that the older, more experienced workers, while might not be as good with digital tools, do a lot better in terms of self-sufficiency and self-confidence. So they can work remotely often better because they don't really need to ask anybody's opinion or permission to do things. They can make decisions, they can carry out the tasks, they can take responsibility. But on the other hand, the younger people might be more in tune with working remotely, generally as a concept, and they tend to be better at technology. So this needs to be taken into account. And again, things like even willingness to work. Some certain workers might not want to work remotely, and then the remote work might not be such a good fit for them to start with. Finally, we have environment, and here we need to ask, how does work environment support remote work? Since oftentimes remote work happens at home, we need to ask questions. Does remote worker has enough space for an office at home? Do they have kids? Would that allow them to work remotely in peace? Do they have technology needed to carry out the remote work? Do they have internet connection? Etc., etc. So a thorough analysis of the work environment needs to be carried out to make sure that workers are able to do work in a longer term. Here again, The preparedness and need for the work environment to be sophisticated will depend on what kind of work people do and how long of a commitment there is to remote work. In temporary settings, this might not be as important. Our second factor for the remote work sustainability is work-life balance or work-life conflicts. So work-life balance in general is difficult with any sort of job, even in traditional setting. We need to balance our goings-on in life, in our families, but also at our work. And it could be often very difficult to combine the two. Work spills out into our family life, and our family life spills out into our work. But this is even more difficult in the remote work setting, because here, all of a sudden, our home and our work become the same place. So the separation between the two disappears. And that can cause additional challenges and additional conflicts. Literature specifically talks about two types of conflicts. First, we have a time-based conflict, and that's purely being able to find a time for both work and life. Remotely, if you are working, you might not always have a very strict schedule, so certain meetings can come in the middle of the night. There might be some deadlines that you want to push at the expense of the home life. And the other way around, the home life might really enter your work. Again, we mentioned kids, we mentioned home responsibilities. Those might prevent you from working productively. So that often leads to those temporal conflicts and to what they call professionalization of the personal time, which can be very stressful. And here what we mean is that, for instance, a time spending with the kids become just the same kind of task with allotted time as, for example, a business meeting or a lecture. Second, we have strain-based conflicts, and those conflicts are more psychological. Here, we might have problems disengaging from one activity when switching to another. So, some things related to the work might still stay with us, even though when finished a work day and we are having a dinner with our family, but we might not be able to fully disengage. Another way around, things that go around you at home while you're working at home might really prevent you to focus on the work itself. And that will cause strain, and that will cause conflict and stress. To deal with this, there is two general strategies that are sort of on the continuum, and people adapt some sort of a hybrid version of these two extreme strategies, I would say, which is segregation and integration. So you could choose either to integrate your life and work together. So if your schedule is quite fluid and your remote work, and so is your family life, you might choose to not have a very strict separation. And you would say that, hey, maybe I can take this meeting while I'm doing my laundry. Or I can write this report while I'm waiting for my kids to leave the school. Segregation, on the other hand, takes more of a position where you clearly segregate life and work. Yes, you might be working in the same space, your home, where you live, but you might choose to have a clear separation. You might have your office room to which you go at 9 o'clock in the morning and you leave it at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And you don't do any life in between that, and you don't do any work outside of those hours. Just kind of similar like you would do in office. The problem here is that it's not always viable to adjust any strategy that might fit you best as a worker. First, it's context dependent. So those three dimensions that we just discussed would make a difference whether you can afford segregation or whether you need to opt for integration. There might not be these 9 to 5 nice working hours if you're working remotely. So that will force you to integrate more. It also depends on the remote work intensity. Depending on how much you do remote work, the different strategies might be viable. So for instance, if you're just working one day of the week from home and rest is in the office, segregation is often possible. You say that, okay, that one day I will really separate myself from my family life and I will focus on work while I'm at home. But if you're doing remote work all the time, for instance, then segregation might get challenging because life will get in the way. There is also a matter of being able to negotiate power at home and at work. And here what we mean is that, okay, can I reschedule my home tasks so that I can afford segregation? Or do I have to integrate those in parallel? And same at work. Are these work hours, are those work meetings, work tasks negotiable? Depending on which side is more inflexible, will determine your strategies that you will choose. And finally, it also is somewhat a gendered question. Very often in the families with kids, there might be more burden on women to take care of kids in many societies. So that will determine whether you can afford segregation, for instance, or whether you have to opt in for integration strategy. Next is a very important, as I mentioned, factor here, which is impact of the remote work on health and well-being. Because remote work does affect different people differently. And there is no consensus of what it actually does to either physical or mental health. So for example, in physical health, on one side, people have more time to engage in the good health behaviors. Exercise, take walks, relax, because you don't need to travel to office, which saves you quite a lot of time and quite a lot of stress. However, research also found that in certain contexts, people, instead of going and exercising, might engage in negative health behaviors, like drinking. So then the physical health effects of being at home will be negative. Same goes to the mental health well-being. Sometimes, in some cases, people do really save themselves from the stress of office politics or being always observed by their boss. But in other cases, people might feel isolated and depressed when they are working from home, even though they don't have these other stress factors. So here, the evidence is not very clear, and it's again very context dependent. So when we are setting our remote work environment, whether we are workers ourselves or leaders who set up the work for others, we really need to consider these factors. There is also one more thing that research suggests that might explain some of this inconsistency in the findings regarding the health and well-being. In this study that was conducted in 2005 and has been replicated a number of times then and used in various theories of the remote work, they observed that remote work relationship with the job satisfaction varies depending on how long one does remote work without interruption. So in the beginning, if you have to switch to remote work, if you have not done it before, you will be confused. You might not have your work environment set up at home, you might not have the practice, you might not know the tools, so your satisfaction will be pretty low. But then, as time goes by, people on average usually enjoy working remotely. It gives you a lot of benefits on saving on commutes, setting up your work day, being flexible on time, being able to combine it with your life. So people are quite happy. But if remote work is uninterrupted for a long time, if you're doing for months or years, eventually the satisfaction starts to decline and people start to feel alienated and distance from their workplace and their work. And that could cause a problem on well-being. An easy way to solve, of course, is to have periodic meetups with the people and not go for the fully remote work setting. But this is not always viable in the modern world. There are more and more companies and organizations that are striving to be fully remote, but also we have unfortunate events that force us to work remotely for a long time. Things like pandemics, wars, natural disasters that have forced many of us around the globe to work remotely for longer periods of time. So in those cases, we cannot just fix it by once in a while going to the office, because there might not be office that is safe or viable. So then it falls more onto the organizational leadership to try to fix this and keep people happy and motivated. It also depends here that whether the remote work arrangements are employee-centered or employer-centered. Again, not very surprisingly, studies have found that the arrangements, the deals that are more employee focused, that focus on employee freedom, on employee productivity, on employee happiness, usually result in better mental health and physical health and well-being as well. And the ones that are more employer-centered, so productivity, performance, usually suffer from these problems of health and well-being. Number 4 is social interaction. And this is an important one. One of the biggest problems that people encounter when starting to work remotely is lack of social interaction. You no longer have a chance to interact with your colleagues. And that causes a number of problems. First, you have straight up professional and social isolation. So you're separated from your colleagues, you don't have social relationship with them anymore, which could create the problems with the company culture or camaraderie. But also, you have professional isolation. Sometimes when you need to ask a question, if you are in the office, you can easily find your colleague and ask them, hey, how do you do this thing? When you are separated from your colleagues by internet, by different work hours, by different geographical locations, this might be difficult. And that will affect your performance and well-being as well. Then you have something that's called situated familiarity. If you are longer working remotely from your colleagues, you lose this familiarity. You don't quite know how to behave around them, whom to ask things, how to ask this, what level of politeness you need to be with a specific person. And that creates additional stress and additional tension. And finally, there is a question of trust and bonding. Gaining people's trust requires frequent interaction with them. And that's very difficult in remote work, especially if you are working with the people that you have not known from before. Trust suffers, and when trust suffers, it has impact on the teamwork, on the productivity, on people's mental well-being, etc., etc. So social interaction is very important. Now, to remedy this, people usually try to do socialization. And in the traditional workplace, socialization is quite easy. You might go for drinks with your colleagues, you might meet them for lunch, etc. But in remote work, if people don't meet at all, this might be difficult. But organizations usually try to set up some sort of a socialization that's virtual, whether it's virtual meetings that are not about work, but are about personal life, creating certain guidebooks of people explaining how to behave or where to get certain information, so they get familiarized with the company and with the people in it, etc. Still, it remains quite challenging to replace a real face-to-face socialization with this, especially in an organization where people don't know each other from the get-go and they're starting virtually from zero. Then, number 5, and the last factor here, is a role of leadership, because the leadership becomes even more important in remote work settings, because leaders need to be able to build trust and support with workers and kind of help workers thrive in more than one way, not just looking at their performance, but also at their sort of well-being and their situation at home. And leaders usually are not trained to do that. In a normal office setting, what goes on in your home is not leaders' problem. But now, all of a sudden, leaders need to be aware of this and compensate for this absence of the office and absence of the face-to-face contact. And the leaders can have these material and non-material resources that they can give their employees to equip them with dealing with the remote work. And that could be as much as things like technology to help them succeed, or it could be moral support or support their certain initiatives to help them deal with these difficult situations. The problem is, though, as we saw from pandemics and in the research before, leaders really fear loss of control. When everybody's in office and leaders are there, they feel very often that they are in the control. They see what everybody is doing, they can go and talk to them, they can see if somebody is struggling. But in the virtual setting, that becomes a lot more difficult. And sometimes leaders can overreact and pass the policies that are not all that smart for these situations. In this study, in this recent study done by Microsoft, has shown that after pandemic, we observe the phenomenon which they refer to as a productivity paranoia from the managers. So when they asked employees and leaders how do they feel about employee performance when they work remotely, 87% of the employees said that they like working remotely and they think that they are as productive as they were before, or even more productive. And we have had and we discussed the similar studies already in the earlier lectures when we introduced the concept of remote work. But when they asked the same question from the leaders, only 12% of the leaders believed that the productivity was as good. So you see a very big mismatch and disbalance between the two views. And that can create a lot of problems for remote work sustainability. Finally, we also have these troubling trends. So when companies switch to the remote work, some leaders choose to still control people very strictly, getting them to install this spyware essentially that forces employees, for example, to keep their camera on all the time, or watch and track their work in terms of like how much they use different work tools and work systems, etc. And research shows that this is not a very productive way to manage it, and it does more harm than good. And there is a different kind of shapes of control that leaders can deploy. And these formal controls could be this direct supervision, time tracking, signaling requirements, getting people to show them that they really do work. And those formal control mechanisms, while they can be useful in the long term, and if they are overused, they're actually damaging to people's morale and work sustainability. But there are more informal control mechanisms as well that might be more productive. This could be more of a based on the peer pressure. Leaders might need to rethink the task design. Again, certain tasks that were performed in the traditional workplace might need to be rethought for the remote work environment reality to increase the productivity and maintain well-being. There needs to be a lot more there also needs to be more dialogue between the leaders and employees, regular reporting, developmental discussions, etc., to actually help leaders to keep on top of the things, but also allow employees to express their worries and their concerns. And finally, what many says is a good way to approach the control in the remote work is to be more outcome-oriented. So instead of asking people that, oh, you need to work 8 hours a day, no, don't put these requirements. Ask them that I want you to do X, Y, Z. If you deliver it, I don't care if you do it in 8 hours or in half an hour. It's all outcome that matters. And remote work leaders need to also evolve from this traditional leader model. They need to be more of a facilitators rather than controllers. They need to set up conditions for people to work well instead of forcing them or controlling them to do so. Leaders also need to become more support-oriented. We already discussed that. You need to be able to provide both professional support, but also social support, because social and professional really clash when the work moves to home from the office. And this needs to be accounted for. It needs to be a lot more value-focused. What is the value that we are delivering? It's not about how much time you spend at work. It's what is it that you do and what is important. And leaders also need to be aware of the differences in inequalities. A good thing about a physical office is that it is kind of an equalizer. Everybody is working in the same building, they have the same equipment, there are same procedures, and same ways of do job. Once people start to move home to do their work, the inequalities come to the forefront. So here we already discussed, it might be inequality in terms of equipment, in terms of type of houses people live, whether people have families or not, whether people can afford segregation or integration. All of these things need to be on the leader's radar. Otherwise, the problems will happen. So these were the 5 factors. I hope that helps you to get a little bit more insight about the remote work and remote work sustainability, and whether as a worker or a manager you will be thinking about setting up a more sustainable, more healthy workplaces. These 5 factors will help you to serve as a sort of a checklist of things that you need to think about. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the course.